Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation here to speak at the Pangeo Showcase. And I'm very excited here to present my work on Xbitinfo, which I've done together with Aaron Spring back at the Max Planck Institute for Metrology in Hamburg. And this is all based on work of Milan Klöver, who actually laid the stones with his Julia implementation of BitInformation. And I'm happy to see that he's also made it to the call today, so we can have good discussions later on. So yeah, Xbitinfo is basically the Pythonic workflow to compress climate data, or actually any sort of geospatial data, um, yeah, with bit information. And in a bit, I show you what that actually means. But first, a bit of history. So I do normally a lot of simulations, large ADSI simulations, and I was running out of disk space. And we all know that in the future, we will have larger simulations. We need more disk space. And so I was looking around at what could be a good opportunity to make more space on the disk. And some colleagues were telling me that I might look into the GRIB format with compression, but I'm not really a fan of GRIB format and thought there must be something better in 2022 where yeah, people can still easily access the data and all the metadata is included and so on. So I looked a little bit around in some papers, and yeah, I saw that there's actually a lot of papers out there, but often the measure of success in them is like that they show images of uncompressed and compressed data, and I wanted to have a more objective way of figuring out how much I can compress data lossy. And yeah, thankfully I found the nice paper of Milan Klöver and his colleagues about compressing atmospheric data into its uh, real information content. So the general workflow to compress a data set, especially with this bit information, is that you have your data set in the beginning as an input. You have to open the data set. You kind of have to figure out how much information is saved in every single bit. So that's the term where you try to find information content, or you can more easily ask the question, how many digits of a number are actually needed for your analysis or to actually save the simulation. Then at the next step, you have to apply this information. So you have to throw the bits away or the decimals that you're not using. So you're rounding the bits. And then finally, to actually make use of this bit rounding, you need to use a compression algorithm to compress the data set. And I will go over these three steps. And to do so, I present an example case, and I use here my large eddy simulations in the North Atlantic. And you actually, later you could scan the QR code, for example, and there's a nice visualization here, 3D, on a 3D globe. Thanks to Tobias Culling for implementing this view. And this really gets great with compression, and that not so much data is actually transferred through the internet connection. So this is my example data set. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and it's like a 624 meter grid spacing. It has more than 4 million cells, 150 levels, and it covers the whole Eureka atomic period. And it's like 3 terabyte uncompressed. So let's see where we end up after bit rounding and the compression. So coming to the first part, so finding the bit information. And here I copy a figure of Milan's paper. And basically what you can do is you look at all the floating point numbers that you have in your simulation, and you write them as bits. So here, for example, there's this number 1.23 and something. And for a float 32, it's like one sign bit, and the exponent bits, and then all the mantissa bits. And the way now that you retrieve the mutual bitwise information is that you look at every single bit and look in, well, here we look in space, for example, around this bit, what like the adjacent grid cells have. And for example, the sign bits, all the numbers adjacent to one single grid cell here are positive. So there's just a 0 sign bit here, and there's no information from one bit to the other. Like the mutual information is 0, since all the bits are identical. If we look at another bit, just for an example, the exponent bit, then we see that the adjacent bits and different grid cells are either 0, and all the zeros are adjacent to each other, or they are 1. So the mutual information is also one bit here. And then if we go to the mantissa bits, take another example, it could be that a 0 is likely close to a 0, and the 1 is likely close to 1, and then the mutual information is larger 0. So overall, what you try to do is that you do this analysis for every grid cell in your data set, look what the bits, how much information you get when you go from one grid cell to another, and then at some point you see that this mutual information basically decreases, and at some point you would then argue that you can cut off that bit and all the rest is basically false information. So if we think about, again, a float with like a lot of digits, then the last digits don't really have any information left. They're just random numbers. While the further you go to the front of that number, the more information is actually in the actual digit. And this is just looking at the same thing, but in bit space. And so we kind of try to find the cutoff bit where we, for example, retain 99% of the real information. So you integrate from the left to the right and then cut off at 99%, but the user can decide where that is. And all the rest, you basically round to 0, those bits. And so the next step is then do this in Python, for example. So here the example case, how does it work with Xbitinformation? And it's quite easy for people who are familiar with xarray. It's just normally loading xarray package, the Xbitinfo package, and then just opening some data set. And the cool thing here is that you can use all the normal xarray IO commands. So you can also create your data set lazily, without doing some transformations before. So this is my data set here. And then searching for the bit information, it's just get bit information. And you probably don't want to do this for the whole time series because it's quite computational expensive. So you only want to do this for time steps where that are characteristics. So for example, you don't want to search for the bit information in shortwave radiation, for example, at night, because then you will throw away a lot of bits that during the day you would actually need. So you have to think a little bit about what are representative time steps. You can run it over longer time periods in the beginning, and then you get your bit information, and depending on that, you can then also apply that to future simulation run, for example. And yeah, Xbitinfo does the really nice thing that it actually wraps around the Julia code that Milan has written. So yeah, the implementation here is definitely the same. And the bit information is also saved to JSON. So when you rerun this, that it's automatically loaded from the JSON file, and you don't have to do the whole calculation again. Yeah, and since we are in xarray space, we also try to have this whole package returning also xarray datasets. So the bit information that you get is as a complete dataset with coordinates. So here you see the bit coordinate for a 32-bit. So the mantissa bits with m something, and the exponent bits, and the sign bit. And since I said in the beginning that for the bit information, you search in specific direction, and my data set has the cell and time direction, you get actually the bit information also along the cell and the time dimension. And yeah, just as an example here, for example, latent heat flux, you see then here the bit information for every single bit. And yeah, as you see here for the last bits, there's no information in these bits. So we can also visualize that. And here again, the Xbitinfo creates a similar plot to the one that is found in Milan's paper, which very nicely shows how much information now is preserved in every single bit. So you can, if we pick up this figure here again, so you see this orange area is basically the area where we would preserve 99% of information, and all the gray area or like greenish area, that's false information, or these would be the bits that we would like to throw away. And yeah, you see also that it's depending on the variable. So we cannot just keep, for example, 4 mantissa bits for all variables. It would only be a good result for the cloud top. Yeah, I think that's cloud top temperature. But for other variables like the surface pressure, for example, we need much more bits to preserve the information. Yeah, so the goal here is really to preserve only the bits that actually also have a real information content. Just as an example now, so if we decide on how much bits we want to throw away, so just going back here, so we can preserve 99%, but some people might want to have like theoretically the 100% preserved, or some people feel like that they might need one more bit, or for the analysis that they are doing, they even just 98% are all right. So you keep these bits in mind, and yeah, then you cut off your numbers and round them by bit rounding, so to the nearest. Yeah, you have your float here, for example, pi, represented in bits, and if you cut off here at this bit where we found this is enough of the information preserved, then you do bit rounding to the nearest float that represents this pi with just these numbers of mantissa bits. and this you do for all your grid cells, and then you have basically all these zeros that are very well compressible. So back to the example. So we have our bit information. So now we say we want to preserve 99% of the information. So we call the function getKeepBits, get the keep bits, and here you see now for each dimension, again, keep bits might be different. And so the nice thing here is, since it's a xarray data set, you can just calculate the maximum along the dimensions, and then you know how many bits you have to restore to at least preserve 99% of information in any direction. So both in time and in space. Yeah. And you can also, the keep bits, you can also modify by yourself. And then it's basically time to combine the data set with the keep bits. So actually do the rounding. And here we use the implementation of num codecs, where there's also bit rounding implemented the same way as it is implemented in Julia by Milan. And you do this, and the nice thing is here that it's returning also a lazy data set. So you haven't done any calculations of the whole data set, and then can look at individual time steps, for example, and plot the result and see how satisfactory you are with the result. And just here on the right-hand side, there is such a visual inspection for one part of the domain, and you see on the rightmost side, you see the original file. So there, all the bits of the float 32 are original. We cut off more and more bits and reduce the size. And I would argue, at least from the image here, the keep bit algorithm, which was, I think, saying for temperature we need 14 keep bits in my simulation. There's also no visual difference here, and even for lower keep bits, for this view, there's no difference visible. Only if we go maybe to 11 keep bits, we start to lose some structures, and yeah, if we go further down, the biggest structures are still preserved, but the lower, the smaller structures are kind of lost. So depending maybe even on your analysis that you're doing, you might even be able to go with a lower amount of keep bits. If you look, for example, try to detect hurricanes or something, which have like a huge signature on the fields. Yeah, and the last step is then the compression. So with the bit rounding itself, you don't gain any disk space, just because you turn ones to zeros. These are still valid floating point numbers, and only the compressor then can actually compress these zeros efficiently together. And we've written 2 wrappers for that, so that makes sure that you also use compression. So we have one wrapper for Zarr files and one for netcdf. But basically, as for loading the data, you can use any xarray method. So you can even write Zarr files, for example, directly to the cloud, and yeah, write your own output function. And then working with the output itself is nothing special. There are no decoders needed, so that's the nice thing about this bit rounding, that there are no additional tools needed. You just can open the data set as you normally would do, and you don't lose any time the only time spent is on decompressing the file, and the decompression, there you can use, for the compressing the data set, you can use any compressors, and like set standard or LZ4 or something. So you also decompress very quickly. And if you have a data set in the cloud, you actually likely gain on speed, just because you don't have to transfer as much data as you would have if the data set is uncompressed. Yeah, and just for reference, we also write down how many bits have been rounded here, so that you can later figure out if some analysis doesn't work for your data set, how much bits you actually have preserved. And I think that's a table here that everyone was looking for. This is just one example here from my simulation. It might be different for other data sets. But if we take an uncompressed netcdf with float 32, I don't know, some simulations are still done with 64, so you could preserve, gain much more compression there. So just 3 time steps are like 700 megabyte or 800 megabyte. So that's our reference here. And I'm not too familiar with the GRIB format, so I tried to do my best to convert the netcdf file to GRIB, and I hope I didn't make any issues here. But even with like compressing with a very good compression algorithm of GRIB2, and using float 32, which is kind of unfair because this compression algorithm is not really made for floats. We can compress it here, but what we actually look for are the values here in the bottom, and that's where we use netcdf with the workflow that I just presented, with the bit information and the bit rounding. And so we get a compression factor here for this data set of, or for these 3 time steps, for a factor of 15, which is quite impressive, I would say. So to sum up a little bit and give also a bit more of an overview where we currently are with these with this implementation of the algorithm. So in the meantime, in the last few months, so Milan was the first one with this bit information, which basically covers the whole workflow from input to output. But since I do not work in Julia, and my colleague also didn't work in Julia, we wrote the wrapper around this. So we cover also the whole workflow, and we actually try to do the most of the implementation also in Python, just because so far some of the wrapping with Julia is still a bit difficult. So for very large data sets, there might be some issues. CDO with the latest version, we also now have actually the whole workflow covered. So if you do like CDOs and don't want to use Xbitinfo, you might also want to try CDO. And the netcdf C library itself has also the bit rounding and the compression if you're using a library larger than 4.9. But Xbitinfo adds a few extra details here, which I think are very nice. So first of all, we save automatically the information, the bit information that is very costly to retrieve, in a JSON file. So for later recomputations, you can just load this JSON file again. Then, since we only create a lazy data set, you can more easily evaluate the results, do your analysis, check if the output for some time steps looks great, and only if you are satisfied with your results, then you actually write and compress the data set with any xarray function to disk. So to summarize, here you see once more just a few functions that you need to open a data set, get the bit information content, decide on how many key bits you want to keep, apply the bit rounding, and then finally write it to netcdf. So I presented here a tool, a Python tool to retrieve, visualize the bit information content, and then to round and compress the data accordingly. The package is installable by pip or conda member, so it's in the conda forge channel. Thanks to Rich and a few others who supported me and are on there quite a lot. And then since we still need to gather user experience, so for example, precipitation fields where you have only chunks of data at some points and otherwise nones, there it's a bit harder to get the bit information content with a mutual information metric. So we collect in the original repository of Milan, we collect all the issues, but also like user experience. So I would really invite you to post your experience there as well. And I would say with Xbitinfo, especially with mutual information, bit rounding, compression, and Zarr, I think we have a very good recipe to make both users and providers of data sets happy. So with this, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Awesome.